Welcome everyone to the public lecture organized by the Slovene Ethnographic Museum within the project Taking Care, Ethnographic and World Cultures Museums as Spaces of Care. My name is Tina Padajic and I'm a museum curator here at the Slovene Ethnographic Museum, where I'm also a national coordinator of the Taking Care project. It's my great pleasure to welcome our future activist in residence, art historian Kanika Gupta, who is going to speak today about the ancient Indian motif of the female and the tree. Very soon, actually, Kanika, we will start with your presentation. So let me just say a few words about Kanika. Kanika holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi on the topic of the ancient Indian motif of the female and the tree. And considering the Taking Care project, her research is important because it connects Indian traditional mythology with very much needed reflection on the possible futures of the planet. So the aim of the project is therefore to explore the world cultures collections in partner museums and use knowledges, values and practices from these collections in addressing the climate change and designing more sustainable futures. So today's lecture is part of the online pre-program organized to share some of the outcomes of our collaboration within this project that has started more than a year ago. The motif of the female and the tree that will be presented today was also taken as a starting point for Kanika's artistic performance with a very intriguing title, The Cursed Land of the Lustful Women. This performance will be presented in Ljubljana during Kanika's residency at the Slovene Ethnographic Museum, but at the end of this lecture, we will also share a trailer of her performance as a sneak peek before it will be available to the general public. So before we start, before I give you a word, Kanika, I would just like to invite our wonderful audience. Let me just check. I'm really happy to see that there are 33 people in the room today. So I would like to invite you all to contribute your questions or comments during the lecture using the chat box option. And at the end of this lecture, we will have a short discussion and then you will be able to speak to Kanika directly. So Kanika, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you for also introducing my performance. So yeah, we can begin with the presentation. So the female and a tree. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this motif if you study Indian art or take even a little bit of interest in it. This is one of the most prolific motifs which started from the beginning of Indian visual tradition, from almost the 2nd century BC. So we have stone sculptures emerging in the Indian subcontinent for the first time in 2nd century BC. That is the earliest date that we can give to sculptural artifacts that we have from India. And from that time itself, we find this one very fascinating image of a female who's holding a tree, or who is sometimes simply standing next to a tree, or interacting with the tree in one way or the other. And this is what we have called, or what the modern scholarship has termed, the female and the tree motif. It is known by various names today in scholarship. And the most prolific name that we know this motif is perhaps Shaladhanjika. She has also been called a Shalastri, a lady with a tree, and it is also popularly known as a Yakshi. And obviously, what is this Yakshi? When we speak or we take the term Yakshi, we refer to something like a deity. We refer to a nature spirit, a nature deity who was associated either with a tree or perhaps with a river or perhaps with a complete forest. And this deity obviously was worshipped by some communities at some point of time. So this had religious or cultic affiliations. But the term Shalabhanjika and the later term of Shalastri does not contain so much of a cultic affiliation within it. Next, please. So what happened in ancient India so that this deity called Yakshi became so immensely popular today and has penetrated the visual imagination of Indian artists from time immemorial? Once upon a time, the Indian subcontinent was deeply, impenetrably forested. And one wonders, where are all these forests today? We have lost so much of this forest wealth. Today, when we look at history, when we observe recorded history that we have today, we get a feeling as if human beings, human species is condemned. We are condemned to completely destroy an ecosystem wherever we live and then seek a newer land and then destroy that newer land as well. But is it true? I think this recorded history is a reflection of what we have very consciously suppressed in history, what we have decided to overlook or not notice. And there are these so many communities, so many people who lived in these forests and lived for a millennia. The Indian subcontinent has existed for lakhs and lakhs of years. And it would be wrong to assume that it had no people, it was uninhabited. It always had people living in it. But what is the difference? We don't know anything about them. People have always lived in these forests and they continue to live across the globe in forests today. People lead a lifestyle, many communities lead a lifestyle which is ecologically more viable and does not treat nature as an enemy. It does not confront nature with enmity. In fact, these communities have a lifestyle which complements nature. And this is something that definitely existed in our past as well. We have only chosen to overlook it. So the first evidence that I bring to you is from the Rig Veda. And this verse says, "Goddess of the wild and forest, who seemed to vanish from the sight, how is it that thou seekest not the village? Now have I praised the forest queen, sweet-scented, redolent of balm, the mother of all sylvan things, who tills not, but hath stores of food." This is a Rigvedic verse which praises, which is dedicated to a forest goddess. It obviously means that at one point of time, there were some people who worshipped these deities, these goddesses, and there were people who were willing to respect them. So from this hymn, it is very evident that the person who's writing this hymn does not see this goddess as his own. This goddess comes from a community that perhaps he himself is not part of. Because he asks her, how is it that you do not seek the village? And then you continue to live in this forest. However, this person wishes to praise this goddess, has respect for this other lifestyle, this another community that he's not part of, and this he has spoken of in this hymn. Next, please. But things change very soon in Indian history. And a history of environment in ancient India, which has been discussed by many scholars before. The most important ones of these definitely is Dr. Ramila Thapar. She has spoken extensively on this. And we have traces of how eventually there are records in the form of folk stories, in the form of texts, which tell us how the attitude of certain people, certain communities changed towards these different communities, towards their natural resources, towards forests. And in order to get into this entire plethora of myths that I'm going to talk about, we have to understand that today in India, we have inherited stories and religious texts which can be put into three big baskets. The first one being the Brahminical religion. And by Brahminical religion, I mean all the literature starting from the Vedas, and then coming to Brahmanas, Aryanyakas, the epic stories, two of them I have discussed here, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and so on, and the Puranas and so on, of course. Then we have the Buddhist texts. And we know that Buddhism started in the 6th century BC. And then we have the third, which is Jainism. Jainism seems to have been older than Buddhism, but the Jain texts that we have today cannot be dated to a very early period. So some of the Buddhist texts would be dated to perhaps 4th century BC. Some would argue even before. But then it is very difficult to do the same with any Jain text. However, some portions of any Jain text might date back to that period, or they might take inspiration from stories or folklore that existed before it. Now, all the stories that we hear come from one of these three cults, one of these three surviving religions. But what happened to all the other spirits, cults, deities that existed in India? And perhaps, of course, this is a global phenomena before the rise of Buddhism, or even after the rise of Buddhism, for that matter. So in India, we have, in fact, these communities continue to survive even today. Some of these deities, with their names and their forms changed, continue to survive even today. So some of them are, for instance, the Naga cult, the snake worshipping cult, the Yakshi cult, for example, or the Yaksha cult, or there are several other similar gods, and they have not left any direct sources or direct stories for us to hear today. We only hear their stories through the text of one of these other religions. And I think this is very important for us to understand that when Buddhism or Brahmanism or Jainism will speak about any of these other quote unquote other cult, they will not tell us the complete quote unquote truth. They will never reveal what the real essence of a Naga cult would be, or what the real essence of a forest deity would be. Why? Because their agenda is very different. The agenda of a Buddhist text would be to portray Buddha as the supreme. And every other deity, every other cult will, in the end of a Buddhist tale, come to Buddha, surrender in front of him, bow down to him, and surrender their own beliefs, tenets, philosophies, and agree with the philosophical holding of Buddha. And the same goes with any other religion. So what I'm trying to say is, when we hear any of these stories, we really have to understand that they come from a certain standpoint. They have a certain agenda. And if we are to interpret these stories correctly, or to understand their essence, we have to take into account the agenda that the authors had when they were authoring such and such texts. And of course, not to say that all the literature from the ancient past that has survived today is extremely patriarchal. That absolutely goes without having any doubt on that matter. But then there are traces of these so-called other communities, other philosophies, other deities in these texts. And these deities are subjugated, assimilated, and then they become slowly a part of these other surviving cults. So the first text that I'm going to talk to you about is called Vasudeva Hindi. This is a Jain text. And this talks about a king who wants to become a Chakravarti. A Chakravarti is a universal monarch. And Vasudeva is the king who is on his path towards becoming a Chakravarti. So Vasudeva Hindi talks about his travels. How is it that Vasudeva, the king, actually becomes a monarch? And it is through matrimonial alliances. Of course, these are portrayed as extremely romantic love affairs, but ultimately these marriages are political marriages. And they help the king Vasudeva to become a Chakravarti. Now, there are many curious stories in Vasudeva Hindi, and one of them actually says that once upon a time, the land was completely forested, and forests were enough, and forests could supply and satisfy all the human needs. So there was no need of agriculture. There was no greed. Human beings did not crave for more than they wanted, and all their desires were satisfied by trees and trees alone. But then there was chaos. And then, in order to end this chaos, the institution of marriage was invented. Now, this is very interesting that the institution of marriage did not exist according to the story when there were trees and all desires were fulfilled by forests, and it had to be invented to correct the chaos. So the moment we venture into some of these stories, we realize that we have strong female characters emerge. The moment we get out of the stringent patriarchal Buddhist, Jain, or Brahminical textual sources, the moment we try and look at the folk stories that have become part of these canonical texts, we realize that we suddenly come across female characters who may have been even stronger. But here they are portrayed in a certain way, which supplements the agenda of the text. Then we have many, many Jatak stories. What are Jatak stories? These are the previous birth stories of Buddha. Now, Buddha all the time will give a lesson. He wants to give a moral to his community, and he will do so in the form of a story. And this story will always involve his own previous birth. And many of these stories talk about something known as in Prakrit. Prakrit is another ancient Indian language. It talks about something known as a Rukha Devata. And Rukha Devata is a tree deity. Rukh is Vriksh, that is a tree. Devata is a deity. Rukha Devata is a tree deity. And in many of these stories, Buddha himself, in fact, is one of these tree spirits. And then he unfolds the entire story. And then in the end, he would give you a moral through these stories. So, for example, these stories are very intriguing for various stories that various contexts which they bring up. For instance, the Ghata Jatak actually talks about the 10 Brishni Heroes. And the 10 Brishni Heroes is an extremely important family in ancient India, which finds reference in so many texts in different ways. And different narratives unfold around these Brishni families. In Ghata Jatak, there are 10 brothers in this Brishni family, and they destroy all the forests around the city of Ayodhya. Again, we have a family, a community which is consciously destroying forests in order to take over a piece of land and govern it and bring it under their control. And that idea is being glorified. Similarly, we have another story called Fandan Jatak, in which we have a tree deity and we have a wild animal, and there is a conflict between this, which results in the death of both. So we have these stories with proliferating number of deities which belong to either a river, they preside over a river, or they preside over a forest, or they preside over a tree. And there are ample references which tell us how a lot of these communities were dealing with these natural resources around them. Ramayana, which is known as a great epic from India, has reference to a demoness, a Rakshasi known as Tadka Yakshi. And this demoness is actually a princess of the forest. She is to be killed in order to save a lot of Brahmins who were conducting a ritual ceremony called Yagya in the forests around this princess, the Tadka Yakshi. Now, why does she have to be murdered? The fact goes that these Brahmins wanted to conduct these yagyas in forests. What is the purpose of this yagya? The purpose is to take over land and to claim the resources of this forest. And when a community takes over the resources of the forest, or perhaps burns it down, or claims it, the people who are living in these forests, the communities who live in these forests, inevitably become slaves to the victorious community. So it's not simply about taking over the deity or the gods or the goddesses of a group of people. It's also initially beginning with conquering or subjugating or assimilating their gods. Then it goes on to the resources that the community dwelled in, and then eventually the people themselves. And this here we in Ramayana we have one very evident example in the form of Tadaka Yakshi, but then the entire Ramayana is full of references of forests, where these Brahmins are wanting to do yagyas, and these Brahmins are being attacked by the people who live in these forests. And then these Brahmins request Ram and Lakshman, the two heroes of this epic, to come and save them, to save them from the atrocities of these forest people. And then, of course, in the story, according to Ramayana, they succeed in killing all these demons and demonesses of the forests. So, of course, an entire community is demonized and thus portrayed. Then we have another very path-breaking reference in Mahabharata. In Mahabharata, we have these 5 Pandav brothers. They are their brothers, and they are given Khandavprasth, and Khandavprasth is a forest. And what do they do to conquer this Khandavprasth? The story actually tells us that Khandavprasth was so deeply forested that initially they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to bring it under their control. And then what they do is they seek the help of Agni Devata. They seek the help of the fire deity. And through fire deity, they are successful in conquering the forests of Khandavprasth, which obviously means that they burnt the entire forests down. And that is how they conquer this land. And it is actually a very a bloody description in some of the versions of Mahabharata that we come across. It says that everybody who was living in these forests, all the communities were killed, some were burnt alive. But then there was this one person who was almost about to lose his life. He was called Maya. And he begged these Pandavas and he says that, do not kill me. And I promise I will make you a great, beautiful palace, a palace of illusions, so to say. And this architect is called Maya. His name is Maya. And therefore, the Pandavas spare his life because he ultimately ends up making the palace in which the Pandavas live. I think this is extremely path-breaking because here we have a direct reference of forest being completely destroyed with the use of fire as a tool. And I think that is happening even today in so many parts of the world. That is one of the easiest way, in fact, that people have been successful in destroying a large forested region. Next, please. So these are references in the textual sources that we come across, and this really is the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more, but these, of course, are some of the most path-breaking moments of how the relationship of nature changes with the human beings in ancient India. However, a lot of these nature deities, these snake cults, these nagas, they continue to be worshipped. We hear stories only from the mouths of, let's say, the Brahminical texts or the Buddhist texts or the Jain texts. And as I said, we do not have the voice of these nature's deities, the people who worshipped these nature deities directly from them today for us to see. But then we have archaeological evidences. We have some archaeological evidences. Like I told you, the earliest stone sculptures from the Indian subcontinent can be dated to roughly 250 BC or 200 BC, 2nd century. And this one example is from a great sculptural school in North India called Mathura. And this is a typical example of the Mathura sculptural style. This is a yaksha, and this image is larger than life size. It's much bigger, it's huge. And you will see, of course, that he has something like a pot belly. His belly is protruding out, which is a typical mark of a yaksha. And why? Because yaksha, like so many other nature deities, is a god of prosperity. He symbolizes fertility, and he symbolizes abundance. And this god, especially this one, is called Manibhadra. Manibhadra was the god of travelers, of caravans, who were traveling across the length and breadth of India and going further northwest in India, and which was further connected to Central Asian trade routes. So this god Manibhadra is the god of travelers. And why is he worshipped by travelers? It's very interesting. Now, perhaps this nature god was, this image, for example, was worshipped under a tree or next to a freshwater body in Mathura. And therefore, perhaps this whole situation also acted as a halt for caravans to stop, and where travelers could feel safe. Safety was a major concern of travelers and caravans in ancient India. And Manibhadra becomes an extremely important god of these traders and caravan leaders. So here we have one example. Next, please. Now, this is also a very interesting idea that definitely existed from pre-Buddhist times in India. And it will also remind you of the story that I just told you, that once upon a time, trees fulfilled all our wishes and desires. There was no need of tilling the land. There was no greed. The institution of marriage did not exist. And here what you see is a sculpture from a place called Besnagar in central India, Madhya Pradesh. You see a tree here, and a tree is actually sprouting something. So if you see, if you can see my cursor, oh, you can't, I guess, but you can notice these bags of gold hanging from the tree, and these are tied to the tree. So this is a representation of the ancient belief that trees could supply all that one ever desired. And here you also have a railing carved in the stone around the tree, which obviously meant that this tree itself was an object of worship at one point of time. Now, it's very interesting that these yakshas and yakshis are also worshipped either next to a water body or next to a nature, some element of nature, or perhaps under a tree in which they resided. And this tree is perhaps one of those trees. And this motive of this wish-fulfilling tree is also known by various names. It is called a kalpadrum. It is called kalpataru, and yeah, we also call it the wish-fulfilling tree. Next, please. Then we have some other similar examples. And what is very interesting about these few sculptures, I think these 4 images that I'm talking about here, is that they do not necessarily appear from a Buddhist context. They do not necessarily appear from a Jain context. It is possible that they were part of maybe a Buddhist structure, but then there's no conclusive evidence to prove that. And it is likely that they did not. I mean, so, and this makes these 4 images and some more images, which I have not brought all the sculptural references here, but these 4 are images where it is possible to say, or it is possible to argue that they are not found within the context of another cult, a cult which won over or subjugated these deities. So here we have another image of a yaksha. Here you have him holding again a bag of gold in his hand, and he looks, if you look at his garment, he has a very earthy feel to it. He does not necessarily give you a feeling of a very royal court. So this is a very, I think it is a very earthy depiction of a nature deity, a yaksha. And this again, you will have a sense of the height of this image by the 2 human figures that you can see in the photograph. This is definitely larger than life size. Then we have this female image. This is also found from Besnagar, central India, Vidisha. And unfortunately, of course, we've lost the hands of this female image. Otherwise, we would have known if she holds anything. But it is possible to say that she too was not found within the context of a stupa at least. Next, please. Then we have a lot of sculptural evidences which subscribe to which belong to the cults of the various other cults, and we have Buddhist examples here. So in case of Buddhism, we have some very major sculptural schools emerge, which carve Buddhist imagery. And I already spoke about the Mathura school of sculptures, and definitely we have a lot of Buddhist imagery coming from there. But the two other most important sculptural styles and sculptural schools are, first is Amravati, and then we have a very unique massive stupa being constructed in Bharuch in 2nd century BC. This stupa in Bharuch is the first of its kind, and it is huge at the scale at which it is built. Now, what is important for us to notice is that how these different elements of nature worship, nature deities, are being used, inculcated, assimilated, and sometimes even subjugated within the visual imagery that we see in this stupa. So, for example, you see in this sculpture that there is foliage, there is a tree, there is a plant which has something sprouting out of it. And what you see in the center is a cubical sort of a structure with a spiral coming out of it. And that is, in fact, an ear ornament. We have actually found real gold ear ornaments which look exactly the same and which are preserved today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So the carver is actually taking inspiration from real jewelry, real ornaments. And the carver is carving these ornaments as they are being sprouted out by these plants, these trees. And obviously this, again, we go back to Kalpadrum or our Kalpataru, which is the idea that trees can fulfill all your desires. In fact, in Bharuch, we also see some trees sprouting out pairs of human figures. So we have couples. We have a male body and a female body sprouting out of a plant, which is a very fascinating idea, because the whole idea of mithuna or sexual union is a depiction of prosperity, of abundance, and a plant or a tree has the capability of fulfilling that desire as well. So yes, it also has an erotic suggestion to it. Next, please. Then we have this sort of imagery, and this is what has given rise to what we know today as the female and the tree motif. And I argue that Bharuch is the earliest sculptural imagery that comes up with this motif of a female and tree, which is today known as a yakshi, which is also known as shalabhanjika. It is also known as shalastri. Now, what do we see here? If we take the example of these two deities, we see that a female clutches a tree and holds its one branch with a hand. In case of some of these figures, we have inscriptions. In case of one, for example, we have the name of this female inscribed on the stem of the tree. And the inscription, which is written in the Brahmi script, says that it says Chanda Yakho. So the inscription actually tells us that this female is a yakshi and her name is Chanda. Now, this is very important for us to understand that a yakshi itself is not a name. When I call somebody a Chanda Yakho, it means that a yakshi becomes something like a designation. And then there could be many yakshis. There need not be one yakshi or 5 yakshis. There could be many. And here in Bharuch, we have more than one yakshi depicted. So very interestingly, one yakshi is seen holding a tree, just in the way these two females are. And we see another yakshi, which is also mentioned by name on the inscription, but she does not hold a tree. So it's very, very complicated and difficult. So who are these deities? Do we also call them tree spirits? Do we call them Rukha Devata? Or do we also call them yakshis? Do we call them Shalastri or Shalabhanjika? But then they, from these two images that you have, they are from Bharuch in Indian Museum, Kolkata today. When we look at them, they have a cultic affiliation when they are present here. And they, at Bharuch, Yeah, so this is the yakshi that I was, yeah, you can go to the next one, Tina. Thank you. Yeah, so on your left is the lady with this tree. You can see that she's holding a tree. She is Chanda Yakho. And on the other side is the other yakshi. And she does not hold a tree. So that makes it extremely complicated, that it is not essential in visual imagery to depict a tree when you depict a yakshi. And yet, yakshi is inevitably connected to some nature spirit, to some element of nature. And that makes it all the more interesting for us. However, what I wanted to say is that when we look at these images from Bharuch, we certainly sense a cultic affiliation within this imagery. And then we really need to understand that here on the Buddhist stupa of Bharuch, these deities have come in salutation to Buddha. So they are already subjugated when they come here, when they are being carved in this stupa. So the people who came to Bharuch worshipping these images obviously also perhaps worshipped yakshis, or also perhaps worshipped nagas or other nature deities. And they also worshipped to the Buddha who were coming to this stupa. Next, please. This is an image from a stupa called Sanchi. And Sanchi is also in central India. It is not very far away from Bharuch, but it is a little later in date from Bharuch. And here what you see is the same motif. Now this whole idea of connecting a female body with a tree has already become iconized. It's already become an icon when it is carved at Bharuch. And it is this iconic image that travels to a lot of other parts of the Indian subcontinent in different sculptural schools. And here at Sanchi, again, it is the same motif. It's almost iconic by now. It becomes so proliferant. It becomes so successful. It truly captures the imagination of the makers as well as the audience. And here you again see this female with a tree. But then notice the change that there at Bharuch, they were standing on the pillars. They were almost on the human scale. But at Sanchi, they are placed at the place of almost a flying buttress. They are taking the place of a gate. This is a big gateway, and they are really on the top. So they do no longer come at the bottom. Their size is reduced considerably, and they become more like decorative elements. They become more as if they are adding a little bit of a design element to the whole structure. They do not play such an important role as they did at Bharuch. And the difference is not just in the space that they are given in their placement, in also the fact that they lose something of their cultic affiliation. By the time this motive, I would call it a motive, it reaches Sanchi, it does not remain so how shall I say, it does not remain so religiously significant within what it depicted. It loses its cultic affiliation by the time it reaches Sanchi, and it becomes more decorative. So it is very evident in this imagery. It would be more appropriate to call this a shalabhanjika or a shalastri. And at Bharuch, perhaps it would be better to call it a yakshi sometimes. And at other times, at Bharuch itself, we see that a female is seen holding a mirror. Sometimes a female is simply holding either perhaps a musical instrument in her hand. And so this whole idea of female imagery proliferating begins with Bharuch itself. And that brings us to this very important question that, we have these so many different cults, so many different deities. We have so many references to communities, for example, the Gandharva community or the Rakshasas and these Asuras, which proliferate in Indian texts. And we do not hear anything directly from them. We do not have any direct textual references to these figures. And how are we to interrogate their histories? How are we to look at these communities? And then, for example, I think I could say that there is this whole philosophy of lokayat. And then we have a very important piece of writing. Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay talks about the philosophy of Lokayat in his book, which is titled Lokayat. And he takes this whole methodology of reading between the lines and comparing different textual sources in order to reach a philosophy which has otherwise been spoken in a very bad, in a very different, in a very negative light by all the other surviving philosophical schools from India. And similarly, the question remains that have we lost these histories forever? I think no. I think we only need to interrogate a little further, a little more, and see that a lot of similar communities exist even today. And I think the project of very consciously erasing, suppressing, and sidelining their quote unquote histories and lifestyle continues even today. And I think if we care to look at it a little more, we can perhaps find that a much better lifestyle, a much better philosophy of living exists, and there's so much more that we can learn from it. Thank you.
Kanika, thank you so much for this really brilliant lecture. I have to say that I found it extremely informative and also enlightening. What I really liked was your selection of those sculptures, because you were able to tell so many different stories around them. That is really fascinating. And I have quite a lot of questions, and I believe that our audience as well. I see that there are some messages in the chat, which I will take a look at them a little bit later, because I would like to ask you the first question, and it has to do with the methodology. You know that I'm really interested in different approaches and theoretical schools and so on. So maybe you can think a little bit about how to explore those delicate traditions. So you said that these philosophies are not accessible directly, but if someone wants to, you know, get to know them better, he or she has to read in between the lines. So my question is how to do this. So I suppose that you also use the comparison between different texts, archaeological materials, archives, and so on. But maybe you can tell us more about this. And my next question, which is very much related to this, is it possible? And if it is possible, how to do it? So is it possible to avoid the projection of our own, you know, ideas and needs from today into the past, when we are dealing with such a topic that we don't have clear evidence about?
Yeah, so I think, yes, the methodological tools that I personally employ in my own research come from the scholarship that I also took one name, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay. So he attempts at interrogating the philosophical school of Lokayata. And the next scholars that I would consider very important is definitely D.D. Koshambi, his writing called Myth and Reality, and then Sharad Patil. And then continuing, we have Suvira Jaiswal, and we have a couple of other, many scholars. But yes, I think it is important to compare different texts, like I said, and to understand the narratives given within these texts as a product of, first of all, a certain socio-political background, a certain material reality, and then as an agenda. So the agenda of a Brahminical text, when somebody writes Mahabharata, is not to document the real history of a Brishni, let's say, prince or hero called Krishna. We know Krishna as a great god in Indian mythology today. But when we read Mahabharata, or when we look at Mahabharata, we have to understand that a recording of history is not the agenda. of Mahabharata. The agenda of Mahabharata clearly is to re-establish, to restate the caste values, the caste structure of the society, and then to place this whole figure of Krishna in a certain light, that he is whatever, he's Vishwarupa or divine or great, which is why we have Bhagavad Gita. But then when we read a text like Vinay Pitak, for instance, so we really need to understand that the idea was to keep the word of Buddha as intact as possible. So Vinay Pitak has a set of rules for the monks and the nuns, what they should do, what they should not do, how should they conduct themselves in society, in the laity, amongst the laity. So what is the agenda of the text? The agenda is to keep this word of Buddha intact as possible. Of course, the agenda of the Jatak stories will change, but then we have to keep that in mind. So for instance, when we hear of the Pandav story in a Jatak tale, which is a Buddhist story, we don't hear of the war. We don't hear of the Brishni war. We only hear of Pandavas, the 5 brothers. They have a wife called Kanha or Draupadi, as we know her. And then they are very happy to state that it is through the female that they will attain sovereignty. So again, we come across an idea where the female becomes very important. The feminine is not as sidelined as in the Mahabharata or as in other Brahminical texts. So there is obviously a very conscious attempt in Mahabharata to portray society in a certain way, to portray women in a certain light. And that is, I think, something if we keep, of course, it's very difficult to date, the question of date, but I think we really need to interrogate these texts from different angles and then perhaps try and reach somewhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to coming to your second question, yes, I think it would be false to say that we can ever be neutral in our writing. I think there can never be a neutral history. There never has been. I think no history has ever been neutral. And I think as a scholar, I think it is more important for me to state my position, to state where I come from, to state my agenda. And I do not ever claim to be writing a neutral historical point of view, because that is just not possible to do so. Mm-hmm. So I think the better way would be to enter a research stating and taking note of one's own place in time and history, and take note of one's own agenda.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it's also important to think about that in the museum setting. So museums are also not neutral and objective, and the transparency is really important when we set up an exhibition or any other also public events, let's say. So thank you for those thoughts. And there is also a very interesting question in the chat box by Michael Lee. Is the texts that describe the destruction of the forests in the texts, excuse me, are there ever reflections about the ecological impact afterwards?
There are very few, but yes, sometimes there are. So for instance, sometimes in the Jatak, we have Rukha Devata himself say that, we should tell that tree spirit who is standing alone at a distance that, if you stand alone, you will be destroyed. Somebody will come and cut you and destroy you. But if we remain together and we remain one and we remain united and strong, nobody will ever be able to damage us. So we sense a certain fear, a sense of fear, which obviously is talking about the fear that some communities must have sensed at some point of time, a threat that they felt. And that threat is indirectly coming into the Jatak story. And Buddha himself is a tree spirit. And the message that he wants to spread in that Jatak is that one must live united. A community, if it has to survive, has to always be united. So yes, it is a very indirect reference to a certain threat that a community can sense. But yes, very outrightly devastating results that we witness today in the sense of, floods and tsunamis and whatnot. No, I don't think we have a lot of reference to that. So yeah, like for instance, I really wanted to say, and I think I missed that this, for instance, the city of Chennai, like Bombay, Delhi, and any other in India, once upon a time, these cities were forested. They had a large number of plantations. They had water bodies. But then today, they shift from either floods towards scarcity of water. And it's very strange. And all the trees have been cut down. The roads, and there's over cementing. So that kind of devastation, I think, is quite unparalleled what we are seeing today in history. But yes, we do have a sense of fear towards this destruction in many stories. Yes.
Michael says, thank you very much. And there is another question in the chat box. I think it's related to the wish fulfilling tree sculpture, I think.
Yeah.
And the question is, don't you think this is an neonic representation of Buddha because it's body tree?
Yeah. So like I said, in Buddhist culture, this idea is definitely assimilated and represented within the visual imagery of Buddhism. But then it is also possible to argue that this image of Kalpavriksha in Besnagar, the image that I am talking about, was not necessarily part of a Buddhist context. It is definitely possible to argue that. Yes. Since we cannot deny that a cult of Yakshi and tree worshipping cult existed in pre-Buddhist times, I think nobody would deny that. Trees, forests, and nature has been worshipped from much before Buddha, much before Jainism, much before any other cult. I think that is one of the first things that any human, any community would worship across the globe. So there is no doubt about the fact that there were these deities which existed in their own right. That cannot be denied.
And you also emphasized the importance of the female figure in those, let's say, traditional societies, forest communities. Based on what we already know about them, about those communities, what can you tell us about the role that women played in that societies?
I think it's, again, the text that we receive today from the Brahminical point of view or Buddhist or Jain point of view, the way they come across to us is very patriarchal and very stringent when it comes to gender. And I think the dating again becomes very problematic because at one point of time, many more texts must have existed or different versions of these texts must have existed. But then the moment, as I said, the moment we come out of the core of these stringent patriarchal ideas, we in the periphery of all these texts, we see female characters. And these female characters within the periphery of these texts are strong. So which obviously means that they must have been much stronger outside of it. Or for that matter, when we look at folklore from any part of India, we immediately come across stronger female narratives. So for example, I'll give you one example of Mahabharata. Draupadi can never pick up a weapon. She cannot pick up arms. So obviously it is something which is just not permitted to her gender. But we have a character called Ghatotkacha, who is the son of one of the Pandavas, Bhim. And in a folk narrative, when he seeks a wife, there is a lady within his community who says that I will marry a man only if he can defeat me in intellectually as well as in fight, in an armed fight. So obviously, here are women who are warriors, and we have so many references to female warriors. In fact, Arthashastra says that right next to a king, you have to have female bodyguards. So he says that the king has to be surrounded only by female bodyguards. And this is a reference from Arthashastra, which is a Brahminical text. So no matter how much they deny, the moment we take ourselves a little on the periphery or to the folklore narratives, we immediately come across these strong female characters. Or another very good example would be Ambapali or Amrapali, who is a Ganika of Vaishali in the Buddhist text, and she is supposed to own or preside over a forest of mango trees. So here is a direct connection. And she's an extremely powerful character in the Buddhist stories. So yeah,
Mm.
which obviously shows that there is some sort of I don't want to call it parallel, because maybe that was mainstream and it is parallel to us today. So there was another reality that existed, and nothing was universal in ancient India. What we receive today is the voice of only a certain number of people, only a certain kind of communities, and we don't hear the rest, which is exactly what I'm trying to say. We never hear directly from the mouth of these Naga cults, these Yakshi cults, these forest people who are still living today. So we have these Mundu speaking communities who still worship trees in central India. And yeah, we may consider them as part of the Brahminical religion, but of course, I don't think they themselves will agree. They might not call themselves Hindu. So yeah.
Yeah, you just mentioned parallel realities, and I would like you to think a little bit with us about possible alternatives. So based on what you have, explored through this motif of the female and the tree, so let's try to imagine together the different futures. What would that be? What do you see as an important message from those traditions for today's society?
Yeah, I think it is very important that we recognize that we live in a capitalist world. And so long as we recognize patterns of capitalism, I think we've already taken the first step. We are sold the idea that if we don't buy a certain product, let's say a certain detergent, we cannot be clean. We are sold the idea that if we don't buy plastic or chemicals in a bottle of plastic, we cannot be beautiful. Or to lead a luxurious life, we need a certain kind of purchase power. I think these ideas are extremely capitalist. And the moment we start recognizing these capitalist patterns, which completely absorb us today, we will realize that there are alternatives, and there always have been alternatives. In fact, the alternatives were the mainstream. And it was not 100 years ago that, human civilizations have survived very successfully. And then it is only today that we are being forced to sort of get into this consumer culture. So I think the beginning is definitely recognizing that we don't have to buy into this idea of being clean in a certain way, being beautiful in a certain way. Only if you buy, only if we go for a certain kind of purchase will we succeed in living a luxurious life, in living a successful life. We all consciously can look at alternatives. And of course, that goes beyond the obvious fact that we all need to make a conscious attempt at working against this plastic and cement culture. I think our stand has been extremely hypocritical in this context. We have been speaking of it for years, for decades, but we have absolutely done nothing about this. And I think change really needs to come from people. We cannot expect our government to make the change. It is not possible. Because a government body which could have banned the manufacture of plastic years ago is not willing to do so, and it will not do it. It is on us. So I think it is only people who can bring the change. I think if we depend on any kind of governmental body to bring the change, it's never going to come. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are slowly coming to the end of today's conversation. So I would again like to invite you to ask a question or add a comment, maybe an idea for the alternatives. Yeah. Maybe I don't see if there is anyone who would like to add something. Let me just check. Okay. Yeah, so I suggest that we finish, Kanika, that we conclude with this conversation today. I would really like to thank you so much for your fascinating lecture and also for this very important discussion.
We can perhaps release the trailer.
Yes, exactly. Maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about it while I'm trying to find the link.
Yeah. So hopefully when I am in Ljubljana, I plan to make a small performance which takes inspirations from a lot of different stories from Buddhist texts and Jain texts, and also some stories from Brahminical texts. And I try and bring the element of these forest deities forth, and I have attempted to create my own narrative. And I plan to focus on the descriptions and references to a lot of forests and water bodies within these texts, and then make a small performance, which will essentially be in an Indian experimental dance style. So we thought that we should release the trailer, or a teaser for this performance today here. It's already uploaded on YouTube. So I invite you all to please take a look and leave your comments and feedback on the link. It would be extremely encouraging.
Thank you, Kanika, so much.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank all of you for being with us today and for questions that you shared in the chat box. And as Kanika said, we would really appreciate your feedbacks, you can also send us any questions if you have, and Kanika, you can also answer them later if this is possible for you.
Yes, absolutely. I would be extremely happy to respond to any queries and questions in the chat box or in the comment section of this video. Please feel free to write back to us. Thank you so much. We would be extremely happy to hear back from you.
Yes, so enjoy this short video and have a pleasant day. Thank you so much for being with us. Bye-bye.